Section O, a new deal for labor. So just so you know, the New Deal is a wonderful thing for labor. And of course, when we're saying labor, we mean unions. So we see the New Deal being a great thing for unions. First off is the New Deal programs help to lower unemployment. So now that unemployment's lower, workers are more willing to kind of stick their necks out for the unions. They kind of are encouraged to be more self-assertive, because if if there's massive unemployment, you're less willing to risk your job to go on strike, that sort of thing. So the New Deal programs, one, help lower unemployment, so it lets the workers actually become a little bit more assertive. And we see in the summer of 1934 just a rash of walkouts or of strikes happening. And here's the deal. The Supreme Court, if you remember, had axed or called the NRA unconstitutional. Remember the NRA with the blue eagle symbol? What it more or less said is different companies would sign up to be a member of the NRA, and because they're a member of the NRA, they would abide by this list of codes. And this list of codes that they were going to follow, if they're a member of the NRA, were definitely pro-labor. So the labor, unions absolutely love the NRA, and once Congress cuts that, once they declare it to be unconstitutional, we see Congress stepping up to help the laborers out. And we see the Magna Carta of labor acts is passed in Congress in 1935, and that's called the Wagner Act. Okay? So the Wagner Act more or less declares that unions have the right to bargain collectively, right? They have the right to exist. They have the right to, be unions, to bargain collectively, to have maybe a spokesperson for the union, negotiate better work hours, better wages, better working conditions with perhaps the boss, and then that would spread equally to everyone in the union. So this is what the laborers had always wanted to happen. So anyway, as a part of the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Board is set up. And this board was supposed to help unions be unions, was supposed to help organize labor. And we see it really benefiting the most the unskilled laborers, because frankly, the skilled laborers had their act together. Remember the AFL? That was kind of a members only club for the skilled laborers. So now that Wagner Act is passed, we see the National Labor Relations Board set up. We see the unskilled laborers start to unionize, okay, with the help. And really the biggest organization that's set up is called the CIO. I know, so many acronyms. But the CIO stands for the Committee for Industrial Organization, and this is led by John L. Lewis, who was the head of the United Mine Workers. And the idea is originally the CIO was under the umbrella, so to speak, of the AFL. Okay, so the AFL was typically only for skilled workers, and the CIO was for unskilled workers. We'll see kind of a lot of tension between these two groups. We see a lot of they just didn't quite get along, so they'll actually split. So we'll see the CIO actually split off and to its own entity. But just so you know, at first it's under the umbrella of the AFL. And really their goal was to go from industry to industry and help to organize the unskilled laborers. So maybe it's in the mines, maybe it's the auto industry. So they're going from industry to industry and helping them to organize. That's what the CIO is doing. And they have this new tactic or this new kind of strike called the sit-down strike. And really it's what it sounds like. Instead of the strikers leaving, the strikers stay put, sit down. So that prevents any strike breakers from coming in, right? Any scabs from coming in. It really shuts down the factory, shuts down, the mine, what have you, okay? And this sit-down strike proves to be very effective. For example, there's a sit-down strike in the General Motors plant or factory in Michigan, and because of this, they get to bargaining back and forth, and officially CIO is recognized as the official union of the General Motors factory. So we're seeing a lot of progress when it comes to the CIO, when it comes to these sit-down strikes. However, some of the smaller companies, not the big General Motor companies, but some of the smaller companies weren't so willing to negotiate with the CIO. Specifically, we see an incident called the Memorial Day Massacre, and this happens with the Republic Steel Company in South Chicago. When workers go on strike, the police start to fire upon workers and picketers. So we don't see, it's not a perfect record after the Wagner Act, but the CIO, organizing unskilled workers, it does a lot. It moves mountains, let's just say that. Okay. Also, Congress passes something called the Fair Labor Standards Act. Fair Labor Standards Act. And this is 1938. And what this is for all industries involved in interstate commerce, right? Because Congress technically can only control companies that go through, interstate, right? Are in more than one state, because this is a federal anything. Anyway, so what this does is it establishes a minimum wage and establishes a maximum hours you can work a week. So the goal was 40 cents an hour, 40 hours a week. That was the goal. And it went a long way with the Fair Labor Standards Acts. Also, it kind of got rid of child labor. It strictly prohibited anyone from 16 from working. Even you had to be over 18 if it was dangerous. So it really helped get rid of child labor. But notably, it excluded certain types of laborers. So, for example, agricultural laborers or domestics were not included along with the Fair Labor Standards Act. Okay? And notably, the people who were working in agriculture, the people who were working as domestics, those typically were Mexican Americans, African Americans, and women. So although the Fair Labor Standards Act was a great step forward for unions, for labor, it really did exclude the minorities. Anyway, so in general, the New Deal supported unions. Roosevelt wants you to join a union. So just talking about the CIO once again, by 1940 it had about 4 million members, including about 200,000 blacks, and it was a pretty sweet deal. Okay, section P, landing challenges the champ. Okay, so this is talking about the election of 1936. And just before we even start talking about this, you need to know the election of 1936 really was a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. You could see it was a struggle between the rich going for the Republicans and the poor going for the Democrats. Well, anyway, in 1936, the Democrats were sitting pretty, right? The New Deal programs were working. A lot of people were getting, their jobs through New Deal programs, so very much loyal to the Democratic Party. So, of course, the Democrats, they're just going to keep Roosevelt. So the Republicans were going to ask now, who's going to fight the champ? Who are we going to put up to bring down FDR? And they decide on nominating Governor of Kansas, Alfred M. Landon. Okay, thus the title, Landing Challenges the Champ. So anyway, Landon was a moderate Republican. He was okay with some of the New Deal programs, but abhorred some of the more extreme ones like Social Security. So that's kind of, his ball of wax there. And he also attacked the Democratic Party for perhaps spending too much. And we see really the Republicans are being backed by one Hoover, former President Hoover, but also something called the American Liberty League. And the American Liberty League was more or less an association of the rich people. Okay, so these rich folks, group of wealthy conservatives, wanted to fight the New Deal programs, and they thought a lot of these New Deal programs or reforms were very socialist. Some even accused them of being communist. So we really see the rich guys voting for the Republicans, supporting them, especially through the American Liberty League, and then the poor folks, which at this time was mostly everyone, supporting the Democrats. So when all was said and done, the Democrats won every single state except for Maine and Vermont. And when we're talking about Congress, we see a huge gain in the 36 election for the Democrats. We see them get over a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the House. So the 36th election, kind of a struggle between the rich and the poor, but definitely a victory for the Democrats all around. Okay, so section Q, 9 old men on the bench. So 9 old men on the bench, we're talking about the Supreme Court. So the 20th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States was ratified in 1933. And what it was supposed to do was kind of shorten the lame duck period a president enjoyed. So for example, right, you were elected to be president in November, but then you weren't actually going to be sworn in till March. So that is a lot of time to be president, especially if you lost the next election. Okay, so say, you're running for 36 election, but you lost, you have those like 4 months where you're just sitting around waiting for the new guy to show up and take over the Oval Office. So the 20th Amendment more or less tried to shorten that kind of lame duck period. So now we see the presidents are sworn in on January 20th or the end of January as opposed to the beginning of March. So the 20th Amendment, praise the Lord. So because FDR won, he is sworn into office once again, but this time in January 20th of 1937. And he took this victory of his in the 36th election as kind of a mandate to continue the New Deal programs. The people have spoken. If they didn't like the New Deal, they would have voted for the other guy, right? So that was his logic. But really what stood in his path were those 9 old men on the bench, right? The Supreme Court. We had seen the Supreme Court kind of shoot down 7 of his programs. The Supreme Court was, first off, they were ultra-conservative, okay? And secondly, they were old. A lot of them would have retired, except for they wanted to make sure they stayed there to kind of shoot down some of these socialist New Deal programs. We see about 6 out of the 9 actually over the age of 70, and not one of them had been appointed by FDR. So what FDR was doing was saying the 1936 election was a mandate of the people saying that they wanted the New Deal programs. And in FDR's mind, he was saying that, the Supreme Court, this is a democracy. The Supreme Court should get in line with what the people want. So if the people want the New Deal programs, as seen by the 36th election, then Supreme Court, you need to get your act together. You need to get behind the American people. This is a democracy. So what FDR does is he comes up with this scheme, and this is called by many the court packing plan. What he did is he asked Congress for the permission to add a new justice or a new judge to the Supreme Court for every member over the age of 70. So remember, at this time there's 9 Supreme Court judges, and 6 of the 9 are over the age of 70. So what he's doing in effect is asking the Supreme Court, or asking Congress, to allow him to pick 6 new members, or to add 6 new members to the Supreme Court. So instead of having 9 members, they'd have 15 members. And the idea here is he wants to kind of put the Supreme Court into his pocket, because we see the Supreme Court being ultra-conservative, has kept shooting down all of his new deal plans. He wants the Supreme Court to stay in line with the New Deal programs, to be more friendly towards it. Well, guess what? This plan was probably the biggest misjudgment he'll make of his career. And that brings us to Section R. The court changes course. So, the court packing plan was not going according to plan. People start to vilify FDR as this kind of dictator who is attempting to break down the system of checks and balances that was so lovingly arranged by our forefathers. And, his idea for this court packing plan was undermined by a couple of different things. One, you just need to know right now, there's 9 people in the Supreme Court, right? So typically what it was is there were 5 conservatives who were against the New Deal programs, and then 4 more liberal judges who were for the New Deal programs. So typically a verdict would come down against the New Deal programs 5-4. But what happens is one of the judges, on their own accord, started to vote with the liberals, or started to vote with the New Deal programs. So now we see the Supreme Court starting to support New Deal programs. For example, it upheld the idea of a state minimum wage for women. It upheld the Wagner Act. It upheld the Social Security Act. So just when, FDR was demanding to get all these new judges, we see the Supreme Court suddenly start to shift to favor New Deal programs. Another thing that undermined this court packing plan was the fact that one of the justices actually retired, and so that allowed FDR to put in his place one of his own appointees, and this was Hugo Black, which is definitely a New Dealer, sort of speak. And in just the big scheme of things, the court packing plan, or that idea, failed, but in the bigger scheme of things, he did get what he wanted. He got a Supreme Court that was more friendly to his New Deal programs. But the downside of the court packing plan is it really left some hard feelings, especially with Congress. Congress didn't like to see FDR taking this kind of giant leap forward, in the sense that he's trying to gain a lot of power by this move. He's trying to put the Supreme Court in his pocket, so Congress is going to resent FDR for that. And we see in the 1937 Congress less willing to work with him. So this court packing plan doesn't work, but not only that, it makes Congress kind of resent him, less willing to work with FDR. All right, Section S. Twilight, not that kind, Twilight of the New Deal. So after his first term, we had that 100 days Congress, things were just zipping along, all these programs are being passed, but now comes his second term, and things are kind of coming to a standstill. The idea of priming the pump, that didn't really work. So we see the economy just inching its way forward, just slowly getting better, just kind of at a standstill. And we see in 1937 kind of what's called a depression within the depression, or what some people call the Roosevelt recession. So kind of a sharp economic downturn in 1937. We had gotten it kind of better during the New Deal programs, but by 37 it kind of was going down again. This is called the Roosevelt recession. And the reason for this kind of recession was twofold. One, that Social Security Act that passed, well, that started to take a payroll tax. So people were having less money to spend because they were taking that Social Security chunk out of every single paycheck. And then additionally, Congress wanted to get kind of their act together, wanted to get their finances under control, because they were not, trying to have a deficit or trying to get into debt, but just naturally, a lot of these programs had exceeded their budgets. So Congress had kind of pulled back the reins on these relief programs, and that also hurt the economy in general. So these two things kind of combined to create the Roosevelt recession. So what happens is Roosevelt has to get creative. He's like, okay, now we're in a depression within the depression. What do we do? So we see a shift in Roosevelt's thinking. Now he turns to, I believe, a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. Okay, and Keynes' idea was that to help stimulate the economy, you would go even further into debt, nationally speaking. So the idea is the government would spend money to enable the kind of a jump start of the national economy. So we see before, yes, we'd come to some amount in debt because of these New Deal programs. Now we're kind of throwing caution out the window. Now we're on purpose spending beyond our means to help kickstart the national or the federal, kickstart America's economy. And this idea from John Maynard Keynes, called Keynesianism, is something that will stick around for decades. Okay, this is a new economic policy that's going to be sticking around for a while, using government funds to help kickstart the economy. All right. So, also just so you know, during this time, something was passed called the Hatch Act, 1939, And the Hatch Act was trying to keep politics out of the federal government, which could kind of seem a bit strange. But remember, the federal government, the bureaucracy, was expanding greatly under the New Deal. And the idea is they wanted to keep kind of political corruption out of the federal bureaucracy. So the Hatch Act more or less said that federal employees couldn't run a campaign. It was just trying to keep politics more or less out of the federal government structure. Let me give you more examples. You couldn't collect campaign contributions from people on welfare, forbid lower level federal officials from campaigning, forbid them from using government funds for political reasons. So it's trying to separate the government bureaucracy from politics. That was the big idea there. Well, anyway, by 1938, the New Deal had slowed down. They were out of new ideas. And in the midterm elections, this election of 38, we see Republicans are making gains. They're not controlling either house. Democrats are still in charge. But, they start to make some gains, Republicans. But really, attention is shifted away from politics and now we're starting to look overseas at some frightful happenings that are starting overseas. That'll be next chapter, though, so don't get too excited. All right, section T, New Deal or Raw Deal. So this section's kind of talking about the critics of the New Deal. So the critics of the New Deal said that FDR did nothing an earthquake could not have done better. So the idea is that had there been a massive earthquake, then there would have been a lot of jobs formed to help recover from the earthquake. So they said, he did nothing special. And they called him a communist, a socialist, that sort of thing. Let's see, there was a fun little saying. Here we go. Quote, the Red New Deal, like Red Communist, the Red New Deal with the Soviet seal endorsed by a Moscow hand, the strange result of an alien cult in a liberty-loving land. So he's calling FDR a communist. And the business people, they kind of hated FDR's, I'll try anything once, sleep before you look philosophy. He just would try anything else. And the business people absolutely hated that. And they said, you're confusing new movement and noise with progress. So they said, yes, he's making changes, but it's not necessarily for the better. And like I said before, we see the federal government's bureaucracy, federal government jobs really, really expanding, kind of leaving behind the power of the state governments. So during this time, we see the national government really taking a much larger prominent place in America, leaving behind the prominence of state governments. And we see the national debt in the 30s will actually double. So we go from about, let me see the numbers. In 32, we had 19 billion in debt, and by 39, we had 40 billion in debt. So we see the national debt doubling. They said the U.S. was short for unlimited spending, not the United States, but unlimited spending, and saying they were harming, the New Deal programs are harming the work ethic, American work ethic, by giving all of these handouts. And, the business people felt that they were being put to the side. Business people thought the government was unfairly favoring the working class. And they figured, why are you punishing us just because we're successful? And they claimed that had the government stayed out of this depression, that business could have straightened things out on their own. They claimed that, had government stayed off their backs, the business could have figured this out on their own. And, their little phrase was a federal pill for every ill, saying, what, business could have gone a long way helping out this depression. State governments had kind of been pushed to the side. And they said, what, it's all about you, the federal government. You thought no one else could help you out. What up with that, huh? Anyway, and they said, FDR had turned this into a one-man super government. He controlled Congress, he tried to control the Supreme Court, and, finally they say, hey, guess what? The New Deal, it didn't work, right? It was more of an aspirin than an actual recovery. It was more of just an aspirin than an actual cure. $20 billion later, and we still see the gap between production and consumption not being closed. We see farm surpluses bigger than ever, and still millions are unemployed. And really, when you're thinking about it, it is not the New Deal that brings America out of the Great Depression. It's actually going to be World War II. So the critics have some valid arguments there, right? And really the New Deal, it didn't really get us out of the Depression. Maybe it would have had given more time, but it is going to be World War II, not the New Deal that ends the Great Depression. All right, section U, FDR's Balance Sheet. So this is kind of FDR's response. These are people who are like, yes, the New Deal did work. So New Dealers defended themselves. They said our goal was relief, and we accomplished our goal. It was accomplished. Yes, there was some waste, there was a little bit of corruption or graft, but that was very minimal. And we had no choice. Like, people were suffering. We had to accept the responsibility of preserving or preventing mass starvation. So people who were defending the New Deal said, hey, you know what? We weren't trying to change the world. We were just trying to give some relief. We did that. And plus, we had no choice. We can't just let Americans starve. All right. And they said, you know what? Things got bad, but we prevented a total collapse of our economy. Now we have national income is more evenly distributed. We allowed people to keep their self-respect by having work programs as opposed to just handing out money. And we purged American industry of the worst of its abuses. So we actually helped industry, thank you very much, by taking away its corruption. We were helping industry. And later on, they'll point to the fact that, yes, we did spend $20 billion on New Deal programs, but we'll spend $220 billion on World War II. So, relatively speaking, it wasn't that much. And then finally, their main argument is that we were able to preserve democracy in the United States. We see, economic collapse all across Europe. But instead of democracy being preserved, we see the rise of fascists. We see the rise of dictators. And they said, yes, the New Deal, there was some corruption, but, it helped people out. There was some relief, and it prevented democracy from crumbling. All right, so that's the end of this chapter 33. Next chapter, kind of the shadow of war, kind of leading up to World War II. And then the next chapter after that, we'll actually jump into World War II itself.